All right, excellent. Hi, my name is Sharmila, and I'll be talking about how to win from opening government today. Few things I want to clarify to set the tone of this talk. This chat is meant to provide a general suggestions based on my own experience as a debater. But coaching is quite personal, so some of them might not work for you. So I encourage testing things out before an actual tournament. Likely that I will be saying something very revolutionary. A lot of the things I will suggest here are things that you already do in your split-second judgment calls, like in prep and during the actual round. Value to be more conscious of the things we intuitively do, and being more deliberate about how we approach dates. So usually what distinguishes speech from a good speech and a good speech from a great one is really the level of deliberateness and precision with which speakers characterize the problem in the debate, or how they structure and discuss their material and move from one part of their case to another. Is a result of strategic awareness of how the debate can play out, so staying one step ahead of opponents, and how best to position your speech and your team's case in the round. So there are 7 things I want to discuss about how to hack OG, and I'll just get right to them. So first, is this general fear that people have of drawing OG. There seems to be a popular impression that it's impossible to win from OG and the debate's going to run away from you while you look helplessly and can't do anything about it. In OG, you have a lot of control over how the debate can play out and how the debate is shaped. And if you are wise about it, and that's partly what this talk is about, you can use this control to preemptively summarize the debate and basically conclude it after your DPM speech. Least unpredictable position to be in the debate. You essentially set the terms of the round, and you are not in any, there's no risk of you getting straight-jacketed by a bad opening case and then having to defend things you don't want to defend, right? Is enough. How many times people screw up an OG simply because they panicked or they rushed into prep for fear of not having enough things to say, and then they made silly mistakes because they took such hasty calls on the case, or they sounded tentative in the PM speech, or they just mentally surrendered upon seeing the draw. Sometimes a mere shift in mindset actually goes a long way in succeeding at OG. So the first step is, when you draw OG, do not panic. Calm down. You can set up a clean and a clear debate, and people will love you for it. So that's the first thing. Mindset is really important. In prep, before you do anything else, it's very important to make sure you have a clear understanding of what the debate is about. It's important even before you start building individual arguments. Sometimes, not always, especially because these days we have info slides all the time, but sometimes you also need to make sure that you and your teammate are on the same page about what the key terms in the debates mean. In the debate means, like that you have the same working definition of key terms. So say the motion is lifting patents on green technology, right? You both need to be on the same page about what green tech means or what patents mean. So assuming you've sorted that out, ask yourself what the core debate is. What was the CA team thinking when they set this motion, right? Like, what are the things then that you need to prove in order to win? And usually this is a fairly straightforward process. So I've listed some questions that might be helpful. You can ask yourself these questions and they might prompt a better awareness of what the debate is about. What might be happening in the world that might be related to this motion? Or groups in the real world are likely to want or not want this policy, or are likely to agree or disagree with your stance. Being done anywhere? How is it playing out? What problem the debate is trying to solve or evaluate? Direct you towards the correct case or the correct core debate. world, the way we solve problems is we identify the problem first, and then we create solutions for these problems, right? But in debate land, it's a bit of the reverse, because we are given the solution to defend, and then we need to reverse engineer to identify the problem, and then we need to make sure there's a fit between the two, right? Important to focus on the specific aspect of the problem that you can address with your arguments. Otherwise, it just isn't relevant to the debate. So for example, in a debate about the West cooperating with Assad in Syria, an extensive discussion of Syrian history and ethnic conflicts is just irrelevant unless you can connect it. That is necessary. So perhaps he might say something like, he's the only one with the capacity and resources to unity among all these groups, even in a slightly problematic way, and absent Assad, ISIS is the only real alternative, or whatever explanation you might want to provide. Every characterization provided of the problem needs to fit the solution you're suggesting in the round. That's the second thing. Understand what the debate is about. Understand the specific aspect of the problem you're solving. That has to be very clear to you before you proceed. What is your position or your stance in the debate? Support, what do you stand for? And more importantly also, what are you trading off? That has to be very clear to you. If it doesn't seem like you're making any trade-offs in the debate and you're winning on everything and everyone is happy, a red flag, and you probably need to rethink your understanding of the debate, because it has to be clear to you what the trade-off is. And then this position or stance of yours will help you filter your material to decide which arguments are more important, more relevant, because every argument needs to directly move your stance. In choosing your stance, we're still on number 3, there are some things to think about. You need to be preemptive. Even if the Prime Minister technically has no one or nothing to rebut yet, thinking comparatively. You should always be thinking comparatively so that your material sticks. What can happen to an OG is that you are forgotten in the debate, right? So the motion alone, even if you don't have anything explicit to rebut, the motion alone should already clue you in on what opposition you. Ask yourself, what do you expect the other side to stand on? What are you giving up? And why is your side still stronger despite that? So for example, when defending offensive speech, answer in your position or in your case, expression and a free exchange of ideas, a superior value to the possible offense that might be felt by some groups. Or when you're defending military action, you probably need to be aware of and already flag all the other possible options and why they've either been exhausted or they're not viable or they're inferior. So it helps to ask yourself, especially if you're proposing something extreme or radical, it helps to ask yourself what the next best thing is that opposition might choose to defend and integrate reasons for why it's sufficient, even in the PM speech. To consider when crafting your stance or your position is of your position. Are there exceptions to your principle? And are you able to differentiate between similar situations to defend your stance? If you want to ban professional modeling for children, what your position is going to be on very competitive sports for children. Are you going to ban it as well, or is there a reason for why you are drawing lines in certain places, right? If you are defending offensive speech, what is your position on speech that explicitly incites violence? Why are they different, if ever? And the next thing that you need to consider when deciding your position or your stance, and this is very, very important, is how strong is your position? That, like as we've said earlier, your solution needs to fit the problem as you've described it, right? A small change is soft, a big change is hard. That's basic. So let's go through like an example. Euthanasia, for example. Restricting it to passive euthanasia, where you deny food or medicine to a patient who is already incredibly sick, who is very close to death, with no hope of cure, consent from multiple physicians and psychologists, especially if the principles you were discussing were things like death dignity, or the right to self-determination of individuals, or the right to quality of life over bare life, right? Version would be doctor-assisted euthanasia for the terminally ill, with little to no hope of a cure, expected decline in the quality of living or in their quality of life. A hard version would be diagnosis of either a terminal illness or debilitating illness, even if there may be some hope of a cure, was the option of doctor-assisted or self-administered euthanasia. And regardless of whether the illness is physical or mental, for example. So that's a harder version of a stance or a position for this motion. My suggestion in general is to take a moderate to hard line debate, even if this is very, very tempting, especially if you're being asked to defend something that seems radical to you. Judges will see through it, and teams will point out the philosophical inconsistencies in your case, or that your solution doesn't actually scale, but might needlessly expend political capital and resources. So on balance, you might actually be doing something counterproductive. With a reasonable hard line, it's easier to stay morally consistent, to keep the moral high ground in the debate, to match the solution to the scale of the problem. You have more complex arguments, you have interesting clashes to make. Audience are also more likely to enjoy a debate with a clear clash side. So that's a third thing, positions and stances. Fourth, and this is heavily related to the previous point, models. Simple and clear definitions are usually the best. An overly complicated definition is hard to remember, hard to track, and sometimes can cause you to contradict yourself. So you'd rather stick to basic and clean. A fan of the policy versus value judgment distinction that's usually drawn to teach debates. I think specific value judgments imply, and our assessment of policies will always be based on a certain value system anyway, right? So I think it just makes more sense when discussing definitions and models to just recognize that some topics require more defining than others. So it's important to consider the nature of the motion, whether it requires an explicit model, and if it does, how much detail is necessary. So for example, banning cosmetic surgery is probably more straightforward than defending providing amnesty to undocumented migrants, right? And it's important to be conscious of this. Some definitions will also require you to make tactical decisions that will affect the kind of arguments you run or the kind of responses that are thrown at you. So for example, if you are proposing state-run centers where people can use drugs, you need this will also be selling these drugs, or is it just providing a space for people to use this? And that's going to change the kinds of arguments some of the arguments you might end up running, or some of the responses, right? Always need to reinvent the wheel. As a matter of fact, often there are policies in the real world that you can base your model on, or that are closely related to your model. So for example, if you're proposing to legalize all drugs, right, that's being sold at the market that for which similar regulations might apply. So you might just want to borrow some elements of that model. It also makes it seem more intuitive and more reasonable, like a next natural logical progression of existing policies already. To consider, and I've alluded to this quite heavily, is that the definition needs to fit your arguments, right? This is tricky because some people will suggest defining the motion first and then moving on to your arguments, and others might suggest identifying your key arguments first and then constructing a definition. These are not linear. I think you do a bit of both simultaneously. You do need to have a sense of what your arguments are going to be while constructing the definition. Things about definitions and models. ideally, the most important elements of the definition need to be introduced in the PM speech. I want this to be very, very clear. And clutch situations. Let's say you weren't informed and this didn't quite happen. If you miss something and you need to clarify it in the second speech, you need to do so in a way that doesn't look like you're saving your partner's butt, right? You may consider saying something along the lines of how the additional things you're mentioning were fairly obvious or easy to infer anyway, or that you didn't think it was necessary to go into that level of detail because normally anyway, and make the other side seem a bit unreasonable. Another way to protect yourself against this is, if you're the prime minister, you might want to offer to take a point of information to allow after you're done introducing the definition, to allow opposition to clarify it if they have any questions. And if they don't offer any points, hopefully this signals to the judge that your definition was reasonably clear. What I'd like to make, and I think this is also very important, is you don't win debates through the model alone. The model is a tool to structure debates and focus the debate on important issues. But what should decide the debate is the analysis of these issues, right? So when setting models, just ask yourself in enough details to ensure that the right debate occurs. Not a self-serving debate necessarily, but the right debate, right? If teams try to unreasonably cut off important arguments from the other side, this usually backfires against them. So don't even like try to model the debate away. Have the debate, right? The fifth thing I wanted to talk about was a very good response game on OG. So earlier we talked about preemption when defining your position and your stance, and even when building specific arguments, right? Now let's discuss more explicit response strategies. You have one speaker who does explicit rebuttal. Need to maximize this opportunity. And once more, this is a mindset thing again. Like, that speaker needs to be going to the debate thinking, my job is to respond. My job is to take down the op case. My job is to extrapolate the op case from material in the leader of opposition speech and POIs and everything else. And I need to take it down. I need to be several steps ahead of them, right? My suggestion is to actually spend a lot of time on the PM speech. And don't worry, it doesn't have a lot of prepared material. Like, in fact, I feel that might be a good thing, because second speaker should be thinking more about how the debate will play out, how they will respond, and during the leader of opposition speech, listening very, very closely so you eviscerate them. And trust me, like, if you had nothing to say before coming into the debate, closely, you will have something to say, right? Whenever an opposition team gives a POI to the prime minister, so when your teammate is speaking, listen closely and try to infer the direction of their case from that. You're gonna have to be doing a lot of extrapolation and then respond or preempt in a comparative analytical form already. We'll talk a bit more about that in number 6. If leader of opposition has a benign sounding counter proposal, don't let them get away with that. Why it might not be mutually exclusive to your model, or that it is insufficient and your model is still necessary. A lot of op teams get away with, you know, organic change or education or more social awareness and things like that. So for example, when defending mandatory voting in elections, right? So let's say you're to defend compulsory voting, and opposition says, you know what, let's just improve our voter education system, which is, I mean, the correct position, because they can't defend the world as it is. I think you come out and go, sure, that's not mutually exclusive to our world. We can also have voter education, but we create more incentives for political parties to reach out to traditionally disenfranchised populations in our world. Also, I want to cast doubt on the willingness of currently absent your proposal to engage in meaningful voter education. Like, you can say, hey, look, the Republican Party seems more invested in getting people to not vote. which they can no longer do if voting is mandatory, right? Which is why our model is necessary for theirs to work. Next, and this is where I think this is still under like having a really good response game. It's very, very important for the second speaker honest with yourself in the round. And sometimes like this is difficult because it's recognizing you might be losing, you're not doing as well, right? But you really need to ask yourself after the LO speech or during the LO speech, or even while listening to your first speaker, right? Case, what is hurting our team the most right now? Where have they done damage? Where haven't we filled in enough material? And you need to plug that gap. But when you do it, make sure it doesn't look like you're covering for your first speaker, right? Like you are the support act. You also always make your first speaker look good. But you need to ask yourself that better in the debate than after, right? What you need to do is respond to the strongest arguments of the other side. And you're gonna have to make some judgment calls here and go, A, this is the strongest material, or this material has potential to get stronger as progress, right? I think it's very important as DPM engage with the best form of the case that you can extrapolate. Like if you have to construct the argument for them, do it and smash it, because otherwise they can get better and you won't have a chance to respond. It does, I mean, it does bode well to also point out that their best case is less likely to happen. But before that, like deal with the best case and deal with the best forms of the argument, even if they were not articulated that way in leader of all. Rebuttals, like here are some basic things to think about. Make sure they don't apply to you, or make sure they don't apply to the same extent. So rebuttal has to be comparative. To concede certain things if disagreeing will make you sound really silly. I'm against the value of what you're defending. Like just don't expect you to win everything, right? They expect you to make trade-offs in the round. Responding well. Next is the sixth point I wanted to make is it's important to stay ahead of the closing themes. So it's true, expect you to directly respond to them, you can't, and they don't expect you to be able to predict everything the closing themes will say. But it's important first to have a lot of material that's preemptive and implicitly responsive, and you only do that by constructing a robust enough case. But also whipping that you want to do in the second speech already, or like some summary analysis or comparative analysis. So you want to make sure your theme is remembered, right? So it might help to think backwards. So you might want to say, what is a summary speech likely to sound like in this round? What are the clashes I expect the whip speaker, summary speaker to bring up? Like, what are the key questions they might want to address? And you know what? If you want to structure your speech that way already, that might be better. Like you might go, the values in this debate are this versus this, or which policy helps us achieve XYZ goals for the opening half already. Also recognize that your first speaker might not have enough time to go into as much detail for every argument. So they might end up providing like a broad framework instead. So fill in those details for the first speaker, and also provide some bits of like integrative analysis already. So just do the meta at second. Arguments were true, but also like why they were important and why they were quite central in the debate, why you've identified the winning issues. So you might have to do a bit of that already. So the same thing we expect like whip speakers to do for their extension speakers, you do for yourself and your teammate already in top half. Stay ahead of closing, right? I mean, it goes without saying that you try to burn as much ground as you can, but you want to be taking credit for the things you do as well, so it lands and it sticks. And the last thing I wanted to discuss are really just like random tricks that you can use. Obvious, it is very important to use points of information to directly attack the premise of closing's case, or to remind them of material you've brought out that they haven't dealt with, or to defend your material against attack. So even if you introduce a new line of analysis, and if you can, write down your points. This is actually very, very useful because like that's the only chance you get to respond. What I want to consider doing is when leader of opposition is speaking, we have POIs, like to let CJ get their POIs in. So you can infer their extension from there and just like do a matter grab already. And ideally you'd have, they are trying to, but I mean that might help if desperate. So yeah, these were some suggestions on how to win from OG, and if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. So you are not explaining the debate to a little child. You're explaining the debate to an average intelligent voter. So this person has a general knowledge base, has enough world awareness to understand major historical events, is able to track your arguments, is able to the links you provide, the substantiation you provide, right? So you're not speaking to a child. But at the same time, I agree that it's important that arguments are presented in a way that's persuasive and in a way that sticks. Because you're appealing not just to logic, but also like people's emotion, right? There is a public speaking dimension to debating. Here, your argument is actually quite important or quite helpful. So you don't just want to bombard people with facts. You want to talk about how your case actually improves the lives of real people in the world. So having certain like narratives or stories can be useful. The way you frame your argument, I think the weighing mechanisms need to be quite explicit in your argument. So it's not just enough to say certain things are good or bad and then expect the judge to weigh it for themselves. So that's, I think, where explaining it to a little child may also come from. Like you want you want to be the ones weighing the values in the debate or weighing the arguments against each other as opposed to leaving it up to the judge. So be explicit about that. Storify, have an explicit weighing metric. Okay. All right, so we have a question about a definitional challenge. Exciting. Okay, two parts in my answer is make sure your definitions are not bad or illegal definitions, right? Like make sure you don't overly restrict the debate. There's a trend, a very strong trend in international debating now that like looks down on like squirrely and sneaky definitions. Like we just think it's bad form, we think it's bad debating, right? Like, so unless judges specify a clear context in the debate, don't narrow it down to a specific place or a specific point in history of the motion, don't squirrel it. These are basic rules that I imagine most people are familiar with. If you are challenged. So a good challenge will mean that the leader of opposition launches an explicit challenge and like for challenging your definition, you will have to defend your definition. So you need to like explain to the judge why it was fair, why it was reasonable, why the grounds don't apply, and maybe they were just like afraid to debate the debate. So you could go an extra step and say, here are some of the things an opposition side could argue, and these are reasonable things. There is a real debate here. What their problem is. Step you take. But like if your definition is challenged by it using some of the strategies I've suggested earlier, but you should defend the definition. I mean, DPM can't come up and say, actually, yeah, they're right, we're changing our definition. Like you can't do that. What happens if CO reframes the debate? Parts again to my answer. The first is you deal with them using POIs, like remind them of the original standard that you set in the round. Be very clear that they're being unresponsive to 30 minutes of debate that happened before them, 35. and that is a problem because it is their job to respond. Get that done through a POI. But the second part to my question is the ability to stop doesn't just happen when they've started speaking. It happens in your own speeches. So you need to make sure that the metrics and the standards that you've used to assess the debate are also fair and also comprehensive. Because if you miss out on an important standard or an important actor, teams are going to ruthlessly capitalize on this, right? So one way to prevent yourself from even being in this situation in the first place, because the best solution is still prevention rather than mitigation through POIs, is when deciding the criteria or the metrics for assessing the debate is to already ask yourself, why are these the standards we are using? Are there other possible standards by which this debate can be judged? Explain that quite explicitly. So sometimes debates are not just about the arguments themselves and whether they're true or not, but also like what is important in the round, right? So when you present arguments and you present standards, you do both. You explain that they're true, but you explain that they are important. They are the metrics by which we should assess the debate and why. That can make it harder for CO to get away with reframing. But if they do, that if you've done a reasonably robust preemptive job, judges will not just disregard your standards. And two, try to deal with them through POIs. That's for CO. If you have a chance to directly engage, I mean, I just realized we might as well discuss what happens if the leader of OP tries to reframe the debate or introduces like arguments that are not relevant to the round. You get the chance to explicitly say that in your DPM speech. So don't just go, you're irrelevant, bye. Like you explain, this is not what this debate is about, explain why. Dismiss material that might come out later on that's also irrelevant, but make sure that it's irrelevant before dismissing it, because if it's not, then you need to respond. So we go back to our, there's a question about any specific advice for DPM. You're like the Spice Girls. You give them what they want, right? Like if Elo says, why did your first speaker not say this? Why did your first speaker not explain this? That's a relevant question. If it's not relevant, explain. If it is, answer it. A way that's not that doesn't make your first speaker look bad. Respond to all of the material of the other side. Focus on the strongest first. Best form of their case for them, even if they haven't done it for themselves, right? So you are kind of introducing new substantive material and developing the case of your first speaker, but at the same time, you're kind of summarizing the debate already, trying to foresee how it will play out and staking your claim there already, like explaining why you've identified the winning issues. So your mindset should be, I am supporting my first speaker, I'm plugging whatever gaps we have in our case, I am making it hard for closing gov to extend by burning a lot of ground already, I am eviscerating the leader of opposition, extrapolated enough about the opposition case to be 3 steps ahead of them in my responses and my arguments. It's not an easy job, but a good DPM, like me also to OGs taking a first or second in the round. We have a question about any suggestions about how prime ministers should structure their speeches. I think it's important to bog down by the definition. Like you shouldn't be setting up the debate for half your speech, right? Like have a strong introduction, reel people in. You need to have a nice hook, full quote, a controversial claim, a story, and whatever works for you, whatever you're more comfortable with. Have a strong introduction, defining the key terms of the motion, so everyone is on the same page about what the terms mean. Identify, like make it clear to the judge that you understand right away what the problem is in the debate. Position yourselves as a team. Expect the core debate to be, or the clash in the debate. standards or metrics you think are essential to judge the debate. Say like in this debate, the team that wins is the team that is able to prove X, Y, Z. This is a standard we're holding ourselves to. And then just move on to your arguments already. Like the first shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. Afterwards, you want to be moving on to your arguments. I understand that like you want to frame your case, frame both the case, but also the individual arguments. So some of the things that some people usually say in the introduction can be pushed down to when they're actually discussing specific arguments already. Suggested structure. The other question was about how OG should spend prep time. So yeah, we've kind of talked about this, but you're right. Let's try to be a bit more explicit. To be honest, I feel most of prep time should be spent improving and perfecting the Prime Minister's speech, because you want to front load as much, right? Like you want a speech that wins it in the first speech, or you want the Prime Minister's speech that's a winning Prime Minister speech that puts a lot of pressure on leader of opposition, that is quite preemptive, such that it becomes harder for them to make the arguments they initially wanted to make. Like they're going to have to delve into additional detail, throw out some of those arguments. That's the kind of Prime Minister speech you want, right? Now, in terms of structure, you need to check with each other for the first like 3 or 4 minutes to see if you are on the same page about how words, but also your understanding of the problem. So the understanding of the problem has to be quite sophisticated, specific, and nuanced, right? So say your debate is about banning cosmetic surgery. You both don't just turn to each other and go, yeah, this is about the objectification of women, or this is about women being assessed based on their physical attractiveness. That is the broader problem, right? But there are specific dimensions of this problem, which is collective action problem, right? The giving women, argue that it's a choice that women make, an informed, rational decision. You realize that in your own of the problem in the first like 3 or 4 minutes. You're like, this is a false choice though, because as more women opt into the procedure, or opt to have the procedure, it becomes harder for other women to say no, because these are the exceptions, these are the expectations to which women are held in general. So it's a trap. Like there's no way out of this, and it's not a real choice that women are presented with. So that's a more specific understanding of the problem, right? And you're like, that is what we want to solve. Stop objectification. Like, how does that objectification play out in this debate? The first 3 to 4 minutes is developing a specific understanding of the problem, and then maybe in the next like 5 minutes, perhaps go through like the key arguments or the key stakeholders without necessarily building the arguments in detail yet. Then check back on mission. Are we sure we are outlining our stance and our position very clearly? What we're trading off. So all of those questions we discussed earlier. Answer for why our trade-offs are worth it and why we are ahead of the other side. Outline those things. And then the last 5 minutes can be spent like in detail. So providing evidence, providing key examples. If you are not able to go into precise detail and depth in the Prime Minister's speech, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it's understandable that you can't. So as a second speaker, in prep and while your first speaker is speaking, be conscious of these gaps already, or these like layers of analysis that might have been missed, and then fill in with more specific details. As a second speaker in prep, you probably want to be helping your teammate preempt how opposition is going to attack your case, because your first speaker is also like stressed, like the definition and the policy, the stance, writing things down, trying to build their own arguments. So do a little bit of preemptive work. It's also going to help you because you're the one who will have to respond to these things explicitly. A more analytical role for the second speaker in prep. You're not really like preparing material necessarily. Also, a lot of things can change after the yellow speech. You are more thinking ahead and helping your first speaker